This is a story about Auschwitz, a place where very sad and terrible things happened during World War II. It's important to learn about what the people there went through, to remember them, and to make sure we always treat each other with kindness and respect. Let's take a closer look at what happened in Auschwitz. When the Allies arrived at Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they saw something very sad and shocking. This place in Poland, started by Germany during World War II, was used for terrible things. Auschwitz had two main parts. The first part was for prisoners of war, and the second part, called Birkenau, saw awful events. Out of about 1.3 million people sent there, 1.1 million were killed. This number is really hard to think about. The people who survived told the world the terrible truth of what happened there. When Hitler was in charge of Germany from 1933 to 1945, he started a terrible plan called the Final Solution. This was a plan to harm and kill a lot of people, especially Jewish people. It's a very sad part of history that reminds us how important it is to be kind and understanding to everyone. Before World War II, Germany already had places called concentration camps. These were like prisons for people the Nazi government didn't like, including Jewish people and those who disagreed with them. But what happened later was even worse. When the Nazis took over Poland, they set up more camps. One of the most well-known people involved was Rudolf Hess. He helped start the first camp at a place called Auschwitz. Auschwitz was picked because it was at a spot where many train tracks met. This made it easier to bring people there from different places. Hess also ordered the building of a crematorium. At first, it was meant to burn the bodies of prisoners who had died. These early steps showed the horrible plans the Nazis had, which led to one of the saddest parts of history. It's important to remember these events so we can learn from them and make sure nothing like it ever happens again. By May 1942, Auschwitz had 3 big ovens that could burn 340 bodies in one day. Sadly, these ovens began to be used for something very terrible. They started burning people who were still alive. This became a symbol of how cruel the Nazi leaders were and how little they cared about people's lives. They kept building more places like these, making 5 in total. When a high-ranking Nazi named Himmler visited Auschwitz in March 1941, he told them to make the camp even bigger so more people could be brought there. This led to the construction of a second camp called Auschwitz II-Birkenau, finished in October 1941. The first camp could hold about 15,000 people, but Birkenau could hold more than 90,000. This huge number shows how the Nazi plans were just beginning, and Birkenau became a place where many heartbreaking things happened to people. It's a really sad part of history that reminds us to always respect and care for each other. In Auschwitz, out of about 1.3 million prisoners, nearly 1.1 million were Jewish. The rest, about 200,000, were mostly non-Jewish Polish people, Roma, also called gypsies, gay people, Soviet prisoners of war, and those who were considered unfit for Hitler's plans in Europe. This part of history is one of the saddest and most shocking. The amount of pain, death, and terrible treatment these prisoners faced is really hard to imagine. When the Soviet Red Army finally got to Auschwitz, they saw the full horror of what had happened there. It's important to remember these events so we can understand how bad things can get when people are treated so cruelly. It teaches us to always treat others with kindness and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. When the Soviet army arrived at Auschwitz, they found a huge pile of shoes left by the people who suffered there. A photo of these shoes is both powerful and sad, showing how terribly the Nazi leaders treated people. Prisoners were brought to Auschwitz in crowded, uncomfortable cattle wagons. What they faced there was even worse. They were given a piece of cloth shaped like a triangle, which was sewn onto their jackets with their prisoner number on it. By July 1942, many of the people sent to Auschwitz were Jewish. Nazi doctors would check the new arrivals, and those they thought couldn't work were told they were going to take a shower. But these weren't normal showers. They were actually gas chambers disguised as bathrooms, and they were used to harm the people. It's a really heartbreaking part of history that reminds us how important it is to be kind and to stand up against cruelty. In Auschwitz, the Nazis used a cruel method to select prisoners they thought couldn't work. This included little kids, old people, pregnant women, and those who were sick or had disabilities. They were put in rooms called gas chambers, where they were exposed to a poisonous gas named Cyclone B. A really sad part of this story is that these prisoners were not listed in the Nazi records, so it's hard to know how many people suffered this terrible fate. Each group of prisoners had to wear a different colored triangle on their shirts to show why they were there. Political prisoners had red triangles, German criminals had green, people like prostitutes, Roma, and gypsies wore black, and gay people wore pink. This system was a way the Nazis labeled and mistreated people. It's a heartbreaking reminder of how important it is to treat everyone with respect and dignity, no matter who they are. In Auschwitz, Jewish prisoners had to wear a yellow badge shaped like the Star of David. This was how the Nazis separated people into different groups. They also used letters stitched on clothing to show each prisoner's nationality. Because of this, a kind of unfair ranking was made, with German prisoners at the top, other non-Jewish prisoners from different countries in the middle, and Jewish prisoners at the very bottom. Those who survived the gas chambers faced a really hard life in the camp. They were forced to work like slaves, and many people died because of being too tired, getting sick, not having enough food, or just from the daily hardships of life in Auschwitz. It was a time filled with suffering and sadness. Remembering these events helps us understand how important it is to treat everyone fairly and with kindness. In Auschwitz, the days were incredibly tough for the prisoners. The men would wake up at 4:30 in the morning, and the women even earlier. The start of the day was signaled by a gong rung by the block supervisor who was in charge of the prisoners in that part of the camp. This person would wake everyone up by ringing the gong and would sometimes use a stick to hurry the prisoners to use the bathroom. The bathrooms were really dirty and caused many people to get sick. For breakfast, the prisoners only got a tiny bit of fake coffee to drink, just enough to keep them working. Then, another gong would ring, and everyone had to go outside and stand in lines of 10 to be counted. They had to stand there for hours, no matter the weather, until the SS officers, who were part of the Nazi forces, finished counting everyone. Working in the camp was very hard. There were no breaks, not even for using the bathroom, which was also kept track of by the officers. The prisoners had to work all day without rest. For lunch, they were given a watery soup that was really bad and not clean. Dinner was just a small piece of bread, often moldy and not good to eat. At the end of the day, there was another roll call. This was when punishments like beatings and hangings happened for any small mistakes. If someone was missing, everyone had to stay standing in line until that person was found. This could take a long time, and it was really hard for the prisoners who were already so tired. At night, after a day filled with hard work and harsh treatment, the prisoners would finally get some rest. This was also when they received any mail, which was a small connection to the outside world. But even then, the terrible conditions and the cruelty of the Nazi officers made life in Auschwitz an absolute nightmare. It's a stark reminder of a very dark time in history. In Auschwitz, Jewish prisoners weren't allowed to get any mail, so they couldn't hear any news from their families. For sleeping, thousands of them were crowded into one big room in a wooden or brick building. When the curfew gong rang at night, the camp would become very quiet. But in this silence, a man named Josef Mengele kept doing terrible things. He was called the Angel of Death because of his cruel experiments on Jewish prisoners, including very young babies. Mengele did things that caused a lot of pain and suffering to many people. His actions were part of the horrible things that happened in Auschwitz and are a reminder of how awful people can be to each other. It's important to remember these stories so we can learn from the past and make sure such bad things don't happen again. The terrible time in Auschwitz, like a long, scary night, finally ended. In 1945, the Soviet army arrived there. They found about 7,800 very sick people still in the camp. Sadly, around 60,000 had been forced to go on a harsh march where many more lost their lives. In total, more than 1 million people suffered and died in this awful place. It's so important to remember what happened and the people who were hurt. We remember this so that nothing like it ever happens again. It's like a reminder to always be kind and to stand up against bad things happening to others. Keeping these stories alive helps us make sure the world doesn't face such sadness again. Don't forget to hit that like button, Subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you more great content. Thanks for being part of our community.